But, as we're exposed over time and, the older we get, most of us aren't getting better. Some of us are. And then the toxic environment a lot of people are exposed to, we damage our endothelium every day. And so I think we have to constantly try to improve and work hard to improve that.
Hey, it's Dr. V. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. And today I want you to say yes to no. And by no, I mean nitric oxide, or NO. This is a very special molecule that is important for blood flow and circulation throughout our body. So this is important for mental function, heart function, lung function, renal function, and yes, sexual function as well. It's something that with our lifestyle, we can actually decrease the amount of nitric oxide in our body. And nitric oxide deficiency is also correlated with all the chronic disease we actually have in America. On today's episode, you're going to learn how to maintain peak nitric oxide levels and also know about new discoveries coming out in nitric oxide space, including a drug that is potentially going to be used to treat COVID. So a little bit more about our guru, Dr. Nathan Bryan, has been pioneering the field of nitric oxide research for nearly 20 years. He is an internationally recognized authority in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry, having authored 5 books and numerous highly cited research papers. He earned his BS in biochemistry from the University of Austin, Texas, and then he went and got his doctoral degree at the Louisiana State University School of Medicine and got a postdoctoral degree at the Boston University School of Medicine in the Whitaker Cardiovascular Institute. In 2006, he was recruited to join the faculty at the University of Texas by Dr. Fareed Murad, who is actually a Nobel Prize winner in the work of nitric oxide. So, ladies and gentlemen, the nitric oxide guru, a good friend of mine, Dr. Nathan Bryan. Nathan Bryan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being a guest on the show. Nathan and I met in the actual World Congress, American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. Nathan was actually one of the premier speakers that I got to introduce on stage, and we've been friends since. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks for your time, Nathan.
Thank you, Ken. It's great to see you.
I see you're in a hotel room. Where are you off to?
Yeah, surprise. I spend about half my nights a year in a hotel room, it seems like. I'm off to Telluride, Colorado. We're taking the family skiing for Christmas.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm glad you took some time away to talk to us. We're going to talk, and I'm not going to, spoil the surprise just yet, but we're going to talk about such an important scientific breakthrough today, a very important molecule that is important for erections, important for circulation, important for brain power. So you're going to want to know about this. And he's going to talk about how you access this molecule and how he's used this molecule, not only for performance, but also to help COVID. So stick around all the way to the end. But I want to know a little bit more about you, Nathan. And people probably talk to you about science all day, but nobody knows about how Nathan turned into the scientist that helped kind of the discovery and knowing so much about this molecule. Tell me about your background. Where did you grow up, and when did you get into science?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I speak an awfully lot about science, and I have certainly an unconventional and unorthodox background. I grew up in small town Texas, a town of probably about 2,000 people. I had less than 100 people in my graduating class. And then what got me interested in science and medicine really was when I was 11 years old, my dad suffered a car accident. He had a back injury, a T11 injury, and it left him paraplegic. And so my brother and I come from a divorced household, and we took care of our dad when he got out of the hospital after 5 months. So we would do the physical therapy. He dealt with decubitus ulcers and pressure sores, for many years. And so we were the home healthcare nurses, and I would notice things that worked, notice things that didn't. And then I always had an interest in science in school. I was good in science and math. And so I went to the University of Texas at Austin, enrolled in the biochemistry program. I had a chance to do undergraduate research as an undergrad, and that was really the most enlightening experience for me, because I can tell you there's nothing like the feeling of discovery. And granted, this was back in the early 90s when we were just getting into protein overexpression and purification. So you could basically sequence and overexpress a protein in bacterium and then basically characterize that whole protein. And then after that, I was went to LSU School of Medicine in the graduate studies program, enrolled in the PhD because I was still interested in the science. And that was early 2000s. And 2 years earlier, a Nobel Prize had been awarded for the discovery of nitric oxide. Lou Ignarro, one of the gentlemen who shared the Nobel Prize, came and gave a lecture, I believe it was in 2001 at the LSU Health Science Center, and had a chance to go have dinner with him that night after his lecture and learned a lot about this intriguing molecule. But perhaps most importantly, learned that there was so little known about this molecule. In fact, back then he said, I'm even shocked that a Nobel Prize was awarded because we know it's important, but we don't know how the human body makes it. We really don't know how to regulate it, and we really don't know how to improve its production. So as a basic scientist, that's called job security, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of unknowns.
So, ladies and gentlemen, he did do the big reveal. The magic molecule we are talking about now is nitric oxide, and this is something that's produced in our body. Now, I get this question a lot, and so if you could tell our viewers, what exactly is nitric oxide? What does it do to the body? And is that the same thing as nitrous gas that you get in the dentist?
No, nitric oxide is NO, or one nitrogen, one oxygen. It is confused with nitrous oxide, which is N2O. That's the dental anesthetic, completely different, and also the nitrous gas in fast cars. So although they're both gases, physically, chemically, biologically, they're completely different. So nitric oxide is a molecule that's produced in the lining of the blood vessels. In fact, it's produced in most cells throughout the body, but it's how cells in the body communicate. And we know without communication within the body, one system talking to the other, things go bad and, disease and dysfunction set in. So it's recognized now, 30 years into, almost 40 years into the basic science research, we know that loss of nitric oxide production is what is responsible for the onset and progression of all chronic disease. And as you know, as a physician, every single chronic disease is characterized by low blood flow.
Yes.
It's hypoxia or ischemia. I mean, those are characteristics of every single dysfunctional organ.
Yeah, I look at it as there seems to be many different culprits, blood flow being a component there, metabolism, insulin resistance. They all seem to come together, and you have these pathways that all lead to very similar things. And you're right, blood flow being, one of the major components as to why cells don't function very well, is they're not getting the nutrients when you're not getting the blood flow. You're not getting the gases, you're not getting the other nutrients that are coming there. And so let's talk a little bit about nitrous oxide and how it works on blood flow.
So it's a vasodilator, meaning that when it's produced by the endothelial cells, those are the cells that line every blood vessel throughout the body, it triggers our smooth muscle that basically regulates smooth muscle tone or vascular tone. When nitric oxide is produced, the blood vessels open up. So then you get increased blood flow and delivery to the downstream tissue. But you made a good point. You have to get the good stuff in, but you also have to get the bad stuff out. And that's all dictated by regulation of blood flow. And nitric oxide does both. It gets the oxygen and nutrients to individual cells of the body. It regulates metabolism, mitochondrial function, and actually helps excrete the toxins from the body, whether it's through our lungs or through our kidneys or through our sweat glands.
Interesting. Now, this is excretion standpoint of how nitric oxide works. Is it just the increased blood flow that allows also increase sort of what we call venous return, and does that also improve in lymphatic function when there's increased blood flow?
It does. It improves. The answer to those is both. And you know that, you use preferential venodilators like organic nitrates in heart failure patients. So nitric oxide can dilate the venous side of the circulation as well. And so that was kind of our naive perception of nitric oxide probably 20 years ago, that it just dilated blood vessels, increased blood flows. Very simple explanation. Now we know it's much more complicated. It controls mitochondrial respiration at the electron transport chain, both complex 4, complex 2. It's part of the insulin signaling pathway. When insulin binds to the insulin receptor, you need nitric oxide to have glucose uptake. If you can't make nitric oxide, you become insulin resistant. diabetic. And the best example is, you get plaque built up in the lining of the blood vessels, you get advanced atherosclerotic disease, and that's the number one killer of men and women worldwide in terms of heart attack.
That's amazing. Talk to us a little bit about what's happening to nitric oxide now. Are you saying then people are really starting to become nitric oxide deficient over time?
Yeah, that's what the science is telling us now with over 160, 170,000 scientific publications in the literature. We've learned a lot. So what we know is that about every decade, and this starts sometimes in our late teens, early 20s, that we lose about 10 to 12% of our endothelial function per decade. So by the time we're 40 or 50 years old, we only have about 50% of the nitric oxide we had when we were younger. And this is on a, kind of a, when you take a broad population and you don't select for the healthy versus the unhealthy. We also know that you can now get nitric oxide activity from the foods we eat, plant-based vegetarian diets, beets, kale, arugula. And so most Americans, part of the standard American diet or the
Yep.
SAD diet, doesn't include those green leafy vegetables. So we're deficient from our diet. We're deficient due to endothelial dysfunction. And when you can't make nitric oxide, disease sets in. And I think that explains the epidemic of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, the number one killer of men and women worldwide. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. And yet most of them are medicated to no avail.
Amazing. So we've discovered basically that so many chronic diseases have a component of altered vascular or alternate blood flow to them, leading for them to get worse over time, diabetes, heart attacks, and things like that. And over time, we lose nitric oxide. But you're also maybe mentioning now that there are things that we are doing lifestyle wise from a diet perspective that is making us, have low nitric oxide as well. Are there additional lifestyle components or lifestyle things that people might be doing that they are unaware of that are decreasing nitric oxide in their body?
That's a very good point. And so I tell people all the time, you have to do 2 things. Number one, you have to recognize what you're doing that's disrupting the natural nitric oxide production. And then number 2, you have to start doing the things that have been clinically and scientifically proven to enhance or restore nitric oxide production. So if we address the first, we're finding that people who use mouthwash shut down about 50% of their nitric oxide production. 200 million Americans wake up every morning and use mouthwash at least once a day. Some people are using it 2 and 3 times a day. Over time, we're seeing, and we published a number of papers on this, you use mouthwash, blood pressure goes up. And this explains resistant hypertension. Ken, as you know, you can put people on antihypertensive medications and their blood pressure isn't normalized because it's the wrong target. It's not a renin-angiotensin problem. It's not a calcium dysregulation. It's not a fluid imbalance. It's an oral dysbiosis.
Right. So what you were saying to people, so that I can explain to people these medical terms, you're basically suggesting the mouthwash used to kind of create, bacteria or take out some bacteria that are useful for the production of nitric oxide.
That's right. So the microbiome is this living organism within us and on us. And so there's good players, there's bad players. And when you use an antiseptic mouthwash, it indiscriminately kills all the bacteria. And then what happens is you decrease the diversity, you decrease the number and the variability of these bacteria, and you lose the ability to generate nitric oxide. So look, 200 million Americans use mouthwash. 200 million Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. Coincidence? I think not.
That's interesting. So it's either decent breath or your blood pressure goes high. But I find that those are very temporary anyway, and they don't work very well. The mouthwashes.
Right. And the other thing that people do, perhaps unknowingly, is taking antacids.
Yeah.
We need stomach acid for a reason, not only to break down proteins into amino acids, but also to generate nitric oxide gas. People are using antacids on a daily basis. Proton pump inhibitors. There's, I think, 200 million prescriptions written in the U.S. every year. That's not even counting the number of over-the-counter purchases, which it's hard to track. So when you take stomach acid out, you decrease nitric oxide production in the lumen of the stomach, but you also increase the metabolite called ADMA that you can measure clinically
Hmm.
that's an inhibitor of nitric oxide production in the lining of the blood vessels. So antacids, specifically proton pump inhibitors, may be the worst medications you can take because they're disrupting nitric oxide production. So those are the two biggies, and overusing antibiotics, because the oral microbiome is important, the gut microbiome is important too. And if you're overusing antibiotics, you disrupt that flora, the microbiome goes haywire, and you start to see systemic symptoms
This is
from that.
how, like, for example, a lot of people reach for the antacids, not understanding that a lot of times just being in a stressful environment and feeling stressed out leads to the lining of your blood vessels not being very good. And then you thinking of treating the problem with these proton pump inhibitors or other products that now actually exacerbate a situation where
That's right.
where you're dropping nitric oxide. So we're not treating the root cause. And a lot of these band-aids that we're giving people are causing more harm than good.
That's right. And these drugs, if you look at the FDA rulings, these drugs were never approved to be taken more than 3 to 5 days. It's an
Right.
acute medical regimen, but you can get them OTC now, and people are popping them like pills, popping them like candy.
Yeah. So you mentioned three drugs. You mentioned the mouthwash, you mentioned and acids, and then you mentioned the antibiotics. The
Right.
foods you talk about is green leafy vegetables and beets. Are there any foods that you would recommend to help with nitric oxide production?
Yeah. So the two things that have been shown to enhance nitric oxide production, and this is revolutionary. Ken, you ready for this?
Yeah.
It's diet and lifestyle. Right. So it's we've known this for a number of years. We've just recently figured out that the mechanism of a proper diet and moderate physical exercise is that it promotes and enhances nitric oxide production, protects you from heart attack and stroke, increases your circulatory system, improves erectile dysfunction. Everything that we're going after, diet and exercise can do it. And that's why exercise is medicine, because when we begin to exercise, there's sheer stress in the lining of the blood vessels trying to get more blood to those working skeletal muscles or the heart muscle. And you do that through the improvement of nitric oxide. So you can stimulate it and activate it. And if you do this long enough, your body will adapt. And that's the mechanism for the preconditioning or the cardioprotective effects of exercise. And then you made a good point too on the diet side. It's green leafy vegetables that contain high amounts of inorganic nitrate. Kale, arugula, spinach, beets, the beetroot. There's a lot of products on the market now with beetroot. That's a nitric oxide generating, or it can be. But again, if you do these things and you use mouthwash, you basically eliminate the effects of both exercise and diet. So you have to stop. I tell people, if you're using mouthwash, you absolutely have to stop.
Amazing. My next question is, I know that there are some test strips that are out there that test for this. How accurate are they? Do you recommend people use them to kind of gauge where, their own levels of nitric oxide?
Well, Ken, I developed those over probably 10 or 12 years ago because the challenge we had when we commercialized technologies and tried to bring novel basic science discoveries to market, you have to show a need, right? And so the interesting thing with nitric oxide is it's not a lab you can pull or a
Hmm.
test you can run like your cholesterol or vitamin D or magnesium. You can't measure nitric oxide because it's a gas and it's gone in less than a second. So I
Right.
developed understanding this, what we call an enterosalivary circuit, whereby
Hmm.
inorganic nitrate is concentrated in our salivary glands. The bacteria on the crypts of the tongue and in the oral microbiome reduce that to nitrite and nitric oxide. So what we're measuring with the test strips is your ability to utilize dietary nitrate to make nitric oxide. So if you're low, to answer your question, if you're low or depleted, there's no such thing as a false negative. You're
Mm.
low. We just don't know why. Then we have to interrogate a little further and figure out what's going on in your life in terms of lifestyle, diet, medications. But however, the problem with that test is there are false positives. So for instance, if you've got an active oral infection and you've got cavities or something, and there's the bacteria, part of our immune system kills off an infection by generating a lot of nitric oxide. So you may have an active oral infection that shows that you have a lot of nitric oxide in your oral cavity, but systemically you're completely depleted. And
Mm.
that's a false positive because we've seen that people come in, they have high blood pressure, they're diabetic, they have erectile dysfunction, all the classical symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency, They light up the test strip like they're optimal, and then we refer them to a dentist and do a full oral exam, and they've got a mouthful of infections.
This episode of the Thrive State podcast is brought to you by Thrive State MD Immunity Supplement. I actually developed this supplement at the start of the coronavirus pandemic. As some of you may know, I'm a frontline healthcare worker and have worked directly with COVID-19 patients. Some of you may also know that during that time, my fiance was pregnant with my daughter. I had a bonus daughter at home, and I also had elderly parents I needed to protect. I wanted to serve my patients at the highest level while making sure that the people around me were safe. And I couldn't find a product that was out there that actually had quality ingredients at meaningful dosages that would keep my immune system operating at its optimal form. I ended up having to buy supplements from multiple different sources to get the right quality, the right quantity, and the right formulation of an immune product I know would keep me safe. And while I never got sick using that formulation, it costed me hundreds and hundreds of dollars. The Thrive State Immunity Formula is a premium immune formula designed to enhance the body's own natural immune defenses. It is a unique blend of well-researched vitamins, minerals, and medicinal mushrooms, including vitamin C and D3, zinc, quercetin, astragalus, cordyceps, reishi, turkey tail, and beta-glucan. Kaya is now born. She's 2 months old as of the time of this recording. I'm still continuing to serve by treating COVID-19 patients, and I feel really confident about my immune system, applying the techniques outlined in my book, Thrive State, and taking the Thrive State MD Immunity Supplement. If you haven't already, pick up my book at thrivestatebook.com. And if you would like an immunity supplement of your own, the listeners of the Thrive State podcast get 20% off by using the code THRIVE20. Remember, you are your best medicine. Now let's get back to the episode. Amazing. You mentioned some of the symptoms that could be associated, and certainly it's basically all the symptoms of the different type of chronic diseases that we have there. People perk up when you mention the word erection. So those people who are, would like to function optimally, or if you're not functioning optimally, nitric oxide is definitely a molecule you should be concerned about. But what might be some other symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency?
Well, we've learned that usually the first is erectile dysfunction, because any chronic disease is loss of regulation of blood flow. So to get an erection, and this is in men and women both, it's not just male-centric. You've got to get an increase in blood flow to the sex organs in both men and women to get an increase in pressure. To get an increase in blood flow, you've got to make nitric oxide to dilate the blood vessels to get the engorgement. If your body can't make nitric oxide, you don't get the engorgement and you fail, both in becoming anorgasmic women and men with erectile dysfunction. So that's number one. That's what we call the canary in the coal mine. Because if you've lost the regulation of blood flow to the pelvic region, you've lost regulation of blood flow to the myocardium, to the coronary arteries, to the cerebral arteries. So you'll start to get, your blood pressure will go up, is probably the second symptom. Because when you lose the ability to make the primary vasodilator, the regulator of blood pressure, your blood pressure goes up. And then people will start to get some dementia, mild cognitive disorders, because when you are calling on your brain to do a certain function, you have to improve blood flow there. And without regulation of blood flow, you lose memory, you can't recall things, you don't perform cognitively as you did. You become exercise intolerant because you can't increase blood flow to working skeletal muscles or to the working heart muscle. It's basic, and you have low energy, because nitric oxide is what controls energy at the cellular level, the ATP at the level of the mitochondria. So everything that I see, all the sick people walking around all the time that have high blood pressure, ED, diabetes, walking around in brain fog, it's a nitric oxide problem. But yet the neurologist doesn't recognize it. The cardiologist doesn't recognize it. The urologist doesn't recognize it. It's a single disease.
Blood flow basically ties back into and is a component of all these diseases that you've mentioned. Viagra and their constituents basically are drugs that actually help elevate nitric oxide in the body, which is why you get the side effect of actually having an erection or increased blood flow.
Well, no, I think that's a misinterpretation. So the PD5 inhibitors like Viagra, they work downstream of nitric oxide. So when
Mm,
nitric oxide is produced, it initiates another second messenger called cyclic GMP. And this is complex biochemistry, but I think it's important because it explains why 45% of the men that are given Viagra don't respond with better erections.
mm,
So you have to have some level of nitric oxide being produced in order for these drugs to work.
I
So what we're
see.
finding that is if you improve nitric oxide production in the corpus cavernosum or in the endothelial cells, and then you give PD5 inhibitors, then they improve with better erections. And then you can actually start to titrate down the doses to make them safe. But yeah, so nitric
Mm.
oxide turns the switch on, and drugs like Viagra keep it on. And that's the reason you're warned against the 4-hour erections, the flushing and the headaches and all the symptoms, all the side effects that you hear on these 45-second commercials.
So
But
you're saying
ED is
basically
really
those drugs, you need the substrate, and people who are deficient and not making enough, for example, these drugs aren't going to work for them.
that's exactly right. You need nitric oxide for these drugs to work. Without nitric oxide, they do not work. So if you improve your nitric oxide, we think over time you can actually wean patients off the PD5 inhibitors. But
Uh,
as we're exposed over time, and the older we get, we're not most of us aren't getting better. Some of us are, and then the toxic environment a lot of people are exposed to. We damage our endothelium every day, and so I think we have to constantly try to improve and work hard to improve that.
You've given us strategies, lifestyle strategies such as diet and exercise to increase nitric oxide. We are to avoid things like mouthwash, like antacids, like antibiotics. Let's now move into the new realms of supplements and some of the exciting medications that are developing. And I'm really excited to hear about how you're using it to kind of treat COVID patients. But
Sure.
let's start, before we move into the drugs, there are certain, a lot of supplements that are out there. I wanted to know your thoughts. A lot of them are beet related, arginine, citrulline. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, some work. I would say 95% of them don't, just based on what we know now about nitric oxide biochemistry and physiology. About 12 years ago, we had these discoveries, and I think I've got more than 24 issued US international patents. So we made discoveries in the nitric oxide field very early on, and then we commercialized these. So I've had supplements on the market for greater than 10 years. I won't mention those by name because it's not my intent. My intent is to educate you on the science so your listeners can make informed decisions. But I tell people, so the arginine citrulline products typically don't work. There's never a condition of nitric oxide deficiency where we have too little arginine or citrulline. In fact, the problem is the engine that converts the arginine to nitric oxide is broken.
Mm.
And clinical studies show that if you give too much L-arginine to a patient with endothelial dysfunction, they actually get worse. So you have to be careful about arginine citrulline products. And then beetroot products, there's hundreds, certainly dozens, if not hundreds on the market now. I've tested every single nitric oxide product that's ever been put on the market. We have some sophisticated instrumentation where we can detect nitric oxide, where we can put it on blood vessel strips to see if it's vasoactive and dilates blood vessels. Most beetroot products do nothing but turn your pee and poop bright red or bright pink. They do nothing
Mm.
in terms of nitric oxide. In fact, we use a lot of these as our placebos in our clinical trials. So what I tell people, if you're looking for a dietary supplement, look for patents. Patents on a box tell you that something innovative has been done there that nobody else can do. And then ask the manufacturer, the company, for published peer-reviewed clinical trials on that product, not an ingredient in the product, on the actual product.
Mm.
Clinical trials are expensive. Most dietary supplements don't work to hit their endpoints. But if you've got a product that works, that restores the normal structure and function of the body, you should be able to see meaningful endpoints in randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. So those are two things I tell people. If you're looking for a dietary supplement, look for those, and then do some research on the company. Do some research on the inventor or the formulator. Have they even published in the nitric oxide literature? I attend these webinars, and you've got these talking heads, and I do a PubMed search, and they've never published a single paper. There's
Right.
170,000 publications, and so this so-called nitric oxide expert has never even published a scientific paper in the field. So don't be fooled by creative marketing. Educate yourself. Science matters. patents, clinical trials are critical.
So what do you have coming up on the pipeline? I know that you have something really exciting that's currently in phase 3 of clinical trials. And just so that I remember, phase 1 is really to make sure that it's safe to use.
Safety,
Phase
that's right.
2 tells you that it's efficacious, and then phase 3 is really almost at the point where something's coming out to market. So you guys have made quite a few strides. So tell us about this product.
Getting into academic research, my whole kind of mission was to make discoveries that would impact mankind. So several years ago, I started a biotech company with the intent of developing nitric oxide drugs, not dietary supplements, which are not meant to cure, treat, prevent, or mitigate any disease, but a drug that you could actually get. You as a physician have a patient, you could write a prescription for them, send them to the pharmacy, and treat a specific condition. We were working on things like ischemic heart disease, heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, really some unmet medical needs that aren't well managed with current medications. And we know that nitric oxide is important. And so we were on that path. And I'll tell you, it usually takes about 10 years and $800 million to get a drug to market. From the time you make the discovery, go through all the FDA filings, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And then comes COVID. And so with this current administration, they created this coronavirus treatment acceleration program.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to file an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, to get approval from the FDA to use our nitric oxide drug technology in COVID patients. And this was very important to us because at that time, back in March or April, it was recognized early on that people who had high blood pressure, diabetes, smokers, kidney injury, pulmonary hypertension, or obese were the ones who did the worst. They had about a higher rate of infection, higher rate of hospitalization, and in some cases about a 10-time higher mortality. And so now we know, we're 10 months later, 11 months later, everything we know about COVID points to a nitric oxide deficiency. So I did mention before, part of our immune response is when we get infected with a virus or bacteria, our immune system mobilizes through regulation of blood flow, and then our macrophages, neutrophils, isolate that area, infected area, generate a lot of nitric oxide, and kill off the infection, whether it's bacterial or virus. And this was published back in 2005, that nitric oxide can inhibit coronavirus replication 15 years ago. So people that are nitric oxide deficient can't elicit an immune response because they can't mobilize their blood cells. And then everybody with the underlying conditions of high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, they're systemically nitric oxide deficient. So if we were going to do a study in the general population, because most people recover from COVID very nicely, the susceptible typically do very poorly, and some people die, unfortunately. We would have to enroll about 80,000 people and we were looking to see if we could reduce hospitalization by 25%. We took the most susceptible, vulnerable population, that's the African American community. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, but they're accounting for almost 50% of the COVID deaths.
Yes.
And we know from a lot of epidemiological data to the biochemistry and physiology and genetics of the African Americans that the reason they have the normal health disparities, African Americans in normal times have higher rate of high blood pressure, diabetes, some cancers, kidney disease, and all that can be explained by accelerated rate of endothelial dysfunction and loss of nitric oxide. So it made perfect sense to me if we went into the African American population and we got our IND approved by the FDA to enroll 840 African American patients aged 50 to 85 with at least one underlying condition, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, smokers, pulmonary disease, or respiratory disease, or a kidney disease. And then we get them within 72 hours of a positive test. Because as you know, in most diseases, you can reach a point of no return. Sure. So our objective was to catch these patients early. Let's implement therapy as soon as we can validate a positive corona. And then we follow them for 30 days. And the cool thing about this, Ken, is, as you may imagine, if you're in poor health and you've been diagnosed with COVID, especially African American, there's a lot of fear. And so we send these patients home with a pulse oximeter, a blood pressure cuff, We monitor their temperature. It connects to the Bluetooth so we can remotely monitor these patients. We have a coordinator call them 2 to 3 times a week just to follow up. And we're getting remarkable results. I mean, it's a double-blinded, placebo-controlled study, but when you see blood oxygen levels go from the mid 80s to the mid 90s in 10 minutes after taking their study medication, this is certainly not a placebo effect. This is what nitric oxide does. This is what nitric oxide is. And so I'm hopeful we'll have this study completed by hopefully mid first quarter of 2021 and have a very safe and effective nitric oxide drug on the market for COVID. And let me just mention, you made a very good point, because we convinced the FDA through our filings that we had enough safety data that we could go straight into a 2B, 3A clinical study, which is specific for African Americans with COVID.
That's amazing. And you think the mechanism of action is a couple-fold. It sounds like initially you not only, in the improvement of the blood flow, but you're suggesting that nitric oxide actually works with the immune system to eradicate the virus.
Well, it's working on multiple points here. It's antiviral, so the epithelial airway is made. It has a lot of endothelial or nitric oxide synthase enzymes. So if you're infected, typically through the nasal cavity is where most people are infected, then our immune system isolates it, generates nitric oxide, prevents the viral replication, prevents progression of disease. Here's the other important thing. There's these so-called long haulers, people that have these collateral symptoms long after the active infection is gone. We know there's an increased blood clotting risk, blood clotting disorders, increased risk of heart attack, pulmonary, kidney disease that survive long after the infection is gone. And it's the cytokine storm, it's the inflammation. So one of my patents is on a method of reducing inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
So we employ this strategy to reduce the inflammation, mitigate the cytokine storm, and improve the endothelial function in these patients. So if you improve endothelial function, you can regulate blood flow, go wherever it needs to go, get the good stuff in, the bad stuff out, help the immune system fight its battles.
And what is the mechanism of action of this new medication?
Well, it's an orally disintegrating lozenge, because
Mm-hmm.
nitric oxide is a gas. It's not a pill you can swallow, because the chemistry would be much different in people that was taking an antacid versus those that don't. So we developed a lozenge that it takes about 5 to 6 minutes. You put it in your mouth, you move it around, it's almost like a sweet tart. And over those 5 to 6 minutes, this matrix falls apart and it generates about 40 parts per million nitric oxide gas. So it's absorbed in the oral cavity. Within about 30 seconds, you can start to see dilation of the carotids and improvement in blood flow. Within 4 hours, we're seeing an improvement in endothelial dysfunction. The blood vessels become healthier. We've seen in earlier patients, pediatric patients with acute kidney injury, kidney function can be restored in a matter of days. It's pretty remarkable. It works on every system in the body. And that's what makes nitric oxide so important.
I would imagine this would lead to a breakthrough in its use in many other chronic diseases once it passes here.
Well, we have a long list of indications we're going after, because there are a number. We have a sick population.
Yeah.
And most people are on multiple meds, some sick, some people are on dozens of medications, and they're still sick. May I explain why they're sick?
Yeah.
So I think if we get, in my philosophy in doing 25 years of research, is understand the extent of disease, that you can rationally design safe and effective therapeutics to get to the root cause. And that's exactly what this type of therapy does. It promotes nitric oxide production, reduces inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction that occurs in every single chronic disease known to man.
That's amazing. Such great information today. And I love to see where this is all going. And I know, doctors are going to have an additional big tool in the tool belt once this thing passes. Do you have any idea as to when this is going to be able to be used in the general market?
Well, we're sitting back and being patient. We've got 5 clinical sites set up across the U.S. We've got a test center in Hyde Park, south side of Chicago, a hotspot, Houston, Jackson, Mississippi, Augusta, Georgia, and then just outside of Orlando, Florida. And so those 5 sites are, we're recruiting patients now, so we're trying to be patient. But I expect based on the number of increasing cases, that we shouldn't have a problem recruiting several more hundred patients over the next couple of months. And then, we'll look at the data, we'll send it to our biostatisticians and see what the data tell us, the active drug versus the placebo. If it's positive, we'll submit our drug application to the FDA, and then it's their job to review it and look for safety and efficacy. And I'm confident, based on the mechanism of action and the history we've had with similar technologies, that it'll be approved if the data turn out as we expect them to.
This is really exciting stuff. I've got one last question for you, but I just wanted to thank you again for your time and let people once again know nitric oxide is a deficiency that is really tied to a lot of chronic diseases, but you can actually mitigate that with a lot of your own choices, your lifestyle, making sure you eat the right things, making sure you get enough exercise. So you don't necessarily need to get this drug. You have what it takes to maintain your nitric oxide levels. Again, Nathan, thank you for letting us know that we should be wary or where we get our supplements from. And I can't wait to find out about what's coming next for this medication, as I know its implications and its indications will be very wide. When people want to find out more about nitric oxide and what you do, where do people find you?
Well, I have the best site, as I created an educational website. It's www.drnathansbryan.com. That's Dr. Nathan, S as in Scott, Bryan. I do a monthly blog. And the point of that website is just educational and bring awareness around nitric oxide, because this is really a situation where what you don't know can kill you. And this is very simple, Ken, as you mentioned. Change your diet, get up and exercise, restore your nitric oxide production, and you'll watch a lot of these chronic symptoms disappear. That's how our body is designed to work. You give the body what it needs, the body heals itself.
That is my message. And that brings me to the very last question. We mentioned lots of different medicines in life, and not of them, they don't have to be drugs at all. So in your life, Nathan, what has been your best medicine?
Well, for me, it was the realization that chronic disease, whether it's cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, heart disease, is caused by two things and two things only. Number one, your body's missing something that it needs. Or number two, it's exposed to something that it doesn't need. And so if you eliminate the source of toxins to figure out if you've got some type of viral infection or bacterial infection, or even toxicity from your friends and family, remove those toxins from your life and then start repleting the missing nutrients. There's nutrient tests now. You can do scans, you can do micronutrient testing. 95% of the US population is deficient in iodine. 75% is deficient in magnesium. These are two of the most critical, and then selenium, chromium, all these trace minerals and nutrients that the food we eat now is depleted of. Yes. So you almost have to supplement. But to me, that's what I practice. I just turned 47 last month. I got the biological age of a 26-year-old, I'm probably in the best shape of my life. And that's what I do. I eliminate the toxicity. I sit in an infrared sauna every day. I exercise every day. I try to eat a moderate, balanced diet, but I travel 120,000 air miles a year. I'll still get over 100,000 air miles this year, even in COVID. So I'm on the go, extremely stressful, but I typically stay very healthy, just following those two fundamental principles.
Excellent principle. And it really rings true that we are our best medicine at the end of the day. So thank you for your time, Nathan. I appreciate you taking time away from your vacation to educate us on this very, very important molecule. Thanks again, Nathan.
Thank you, Ken. Great being with you.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you're finding this podcast to be valuable, if you're learning a lot, please share it with your friends and family members. And please consider leaving a 5-star review at ratethispodcast.com/ThriveState. That review is really going to help the show grow. And if you haven't already, pick up a copy of my book, Thrive State, at thrivestatebook.com. I would love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and LinkedIn at KienVu MD. Remember, you are your best medicine.